Hello again, and welcome back to CM4D Basic Training. In this module, we will be considering some of the major options involved in creating and modifying a chart annotation. So the previous module that we worked with involved creating and changing the styling of text annotations. When we work with a chart, we'll have some similar options, except there'll be more options involved with the plot space, where the markers for sample indicators appear. We'll take a look at that right now, but first what I will do is make a new page just for the chart objects. So I'll go here to Sheets, which is a sheet set that allows you to control how many sheet sets and sheets per set exist in the report. By default, there is one main set and one sheet. What I can do is rename this one sheet by double clicking on it, calling this text boxes. And what I'll do is make a new sheet just for the chart. So I will go to the top where it says main set, right click and choose new sheet, and I'll create a sheet called chart annotations. This is just for training purposes. Again, depending on the company, they may have a particular layout they need for different sheets. They might need to create multiple sheet sets depending on the type of data they want to display. But just for training purposes, we'll make another sheet. And then down at the bottom in this main space, you'll see that it created a new tab that we can click on to get to the chart annotations. There are some other tabs here for the sheet set that we can click on, such as Array, that will show us all the sheets within this one set. There's other various options to hide images or to find our way around the multiple pages. But in general, we can simply go to Array to view all of them, or click on the individual tab to get to that specific sheet. We could do the same by clicking here in the tree menu for the sheets. I could right click and choose View Sheet to go to that sheet, and do the same for the new one that I just created. So I'm going to go back to the Sheet Set tab, and to create a chart object, it's similar to what we did for the text object. What we will do is click on the chart object or icon, and again it will change the cursor to a special icon for the chart. If we click and drag, we don't want to make an object too big or too small, but we want to make something that would be readable but allow for multiple charts on a page, depending on what we want to display. And I think we will start off with just a typical trend chart. So that's the chart object. If you notice, when we make a new page, we don't have the view, but we can always click here on New View and create a view object on the page as well in order to display the data or the CAD image. So we have a text box here. I'm sorry, we have a chart object here that is completely blank. The first thing that we can do is connect this to a source of data. Again, we can connect this to one of the data sets. So if I go to Properties, I can go here to data source, which is a common tab that all annotations would have. And here where it says data set, I can choose, again, this a data set. And in this case, I'll say use row 1 through 1. And then if you notice, it will plot the points for the values that are on first row of this data set. But of course, we want to know how to modify and change the cosmetics of this chart. I can zoom in on this a little more by clicking on the chart, using my zoom in buttons at the top, zoom selected. That will zoom the camera into the chart object itself. So let's say we want to display the feature name of this chart. When you have a chart, you can go to Edit and go into the chart properties. So there are certain objects that are inside the chart annotation right now. And when you are in edit mode, you'll have this blue border around the perimeter of the chart, and you can access those other objects that are in the chart. So by default, you start with a text box and a plot space. If we click on this text box, I could right click and go to edit for this. And then like we did before in the text box exercise, if I right clicked again, I can go to insert variable and choose the variable type. So in this case, I can do label. It will insert the label variable in this box. Now I can click exit, but as long as the blue border is around this chart, then the variable won't resolve. So I'll have to put my cursor outside of the text box, and let me use the minus key to zoom out a little bit. If I put my cursor outside of the chart object, you'll see that it changes to exit. So if I click on the outside, then the variable will resolve to whatever the chart itself is looking at. So this text box, if I go back into it, if I go to properties, if you notice this text box, while it's in the chart, does not have its own data source tab, because the data source of this text object would be whatever the chart itself is connecting to. Now, we can also add new elements into the chart when the chart is in edit mode, which again you can tell by the blue border. So if I right click, go to edit. While I'm in edit mode, there'll be certain icons that I can still click on at the top. These are things that you can include or create inside the boundary of this chart. So if I clicked on text, I could create another text box within this chart. And this text box would exist within the boundaries of the chart. So by adding other elements such as text boxes or tables, pictures or shapes, you can add elements into the chart and modify it to display the data how you see fit, depending on what formatting your customer might want. So let's say that we want to move this over into the corner. One thing that could help with formatting and arranging things within a chart, if I click on exit, would be something called grid options. So on the white space here, if I right click, I have this ability to toggle grid. And then if I right click again, where it says grid size, I can choose how finely graded this grid is. So right now it's at value 1. If I made that value 2, then the spacing between the dots would be twice as big. And when this option is turned on, when I move my chart, it will automatically align with any of the grid markings. So that if I go back inside the chart, the same is true for the objects within the chart. So let's say I want to include more information in this chart about this point. For instance, what is the dimension for the data being measured? What are the nominal values? Are there any statistics I want to see? Well, I can do that by adding another text box or table object. And in that object, if I right click and go to properties, this is another place where I can add in variables. Again, there's a list of variables that exist in the software, or I can type what the variables are based on my knowledge into this text box. So let's say that I want to know what the X, Y, and Z nominal of this point is. I could type X equals, and then use the variable for X nominal. In that case, it would be tilde nom comma X. I could then do for Y, which would be tilde nom comma Y. And then for Z, I could say tilde nom comma Z. So if I do that, it will resolve the variables. But again, if you notice the size of the font is a little too big, so that's a cosmetic change that I would make to the text box itself. So I could go here to Setup, Font, change the sizing. Or use this size to fit option. So that's one option. And then if I wanted to look at some statistics for this data point or this feature, I could create another text box, or if I held Control and dragged this one, it would make a copy. And here I could go to properties for this and maybe put in statistics, for instance. Average value, maybe range. That's the variable for range. And then perhaps standard deviation. That would be the variable for standard deviation. or other statistics such as CP or CPK. Those could be added in as well. And then if I wanted to put in a variable for the type of data it's displaying, I made a text box here. I could go to the properties of that box, put in CHR, which is the variable for the characteristic or the dimension for the data being displayed or that exists for the row that this chart is connecting to. And of course we could use the stylings that we looked at in the previous module for text boxes to change the styling, the font size, the weight, and different things like that that affect the cosmetics of the font and the styling in the chart. While I'm in here, I could also click on the plot space, increase the size and the depth. And of course, if you notice, it would change the sizing of some of the markers for the features, but those objects can be changed as well. So to change or edit things about the plot space itself, what we can do is right click on the chart, go to properties, and then you'll see this area here for components. These are all the components that you have created within the chart itself. So if I click on this component and then hit edit, it will take me into options for the plot space itself. So if you look at this, you have a series of different tabs. The main one being used for most of the charts that are created would be plot general and then plot top area. So plot general has to do with some of the general settings for the chart. In other modules, we can talk about causes, assigning causes. This is an area where if you have causes assigned to the data, cause being a explanation for a data value, you can have that turned on, view cause comments as well, change the style of what the font would look like for that cause. Here we have top plot area and bottom area. This is for cases where you might have a control chart. In control charts like X bar and R or X bar moving range, basically you will have two plot spaces. You'll have an upper and then a lower. And these percentages help you decide what percentage of the real estate for this area will each plot space get. So for a standard trend chart where you're only looking at one plot space, this top plot area would be 100%, which is why this area has 100% of the plot space. But you can change that according to whatever percentages you wanted if you needed to have a control chart to view data. This horizontal axis determines settings about this axis on the bottom. You can have it located here on the bottom or move it to the top where it will be at the top of this area here. So if I hit OK and OK, now those tick points are at the top of this area. So if I go back to that, I can choose bottom. The axis style is about the font size of that area. So you can choose the pen, the font, and then of course formatting as well if you're going to display actual values within there. So, and these options will be the same as the other text options we saw in the text boxes. The tick size has to do with the marker before you see the actual indicator for the sample. Right now it's the default set to 3. I can set that to 0 or some other number, and that will change the size of this marker here. So in this case the tick mark just went away, and I have the default sample label that shows up here. So the scale has to do with how many tick boxes you will see here for the different markers indicating your samples. By default it's set to auto, so that means that whatever the settings are in the data set that this is connecting to, however many samples exist for the data set, that's how many samples you'll see displayed here along the bottom of the chart. We could turn that off and give a minimum and maximum of some particular number. If I did 0 and 30, then I'll always have 30 slots for samples to appear within this chart. And it would look like this. So right now there's 10 samples being loaded, but there's room for an extra 20 for this to grow out. So if that's turned back on, then the chart will automatically scale horizontally based on whatever sample values you have in your data set. So next to that there is the label that is going to be displayed for the sample indicators. By default it has text and it has a blank field. This will just end up resolving as the sample label that was loaded for those samples. And from Datasmith, we saw that the sample label was simply the date and time that we put together to have a unique ID, and that's what will be displayed. But if we wanted to change that to something else, here where it says text, we could enter a variable to resolve something else instead of just the sample label. So if you had a sample filter, you could put in the sample filter variable here to resolve what the value would be for that particular filter for each of the samples. You could put in something like date time to resolve that to just a particular date or time, or even something like deviation here. This is a variable to report the deviation of the sample. If I used that and hit OK, then this value resolves to whatever the deviation is for that particular sample. Likewise, you can use number sequence or alpha sequence. That is just a counter, or an alpha sequence where it starts with A and increments up. You can use a combination of variables here as well if you wanted to, such as deviation, or say sample comma date deviation. So if you look, it'll have the date and then the deviation there. So depending on the real estate, how much space you have available, you can decide what is the relevant information to show here as the sample indicator in this field. And then of course, if you wanted to change the size of the font for that field, you'll go here to Access Style and change what this is as well. So if you wanted to change the scaling, vertical scaling of the chart, as well as add in lines like your nominal line, tolerance lines, or change the indication of the markers, that's also done here in Plot Space. But instead of Plot General, you would go to Plot Top Area. So here you have different buttons to change the type of lines that you see, the series markers, or the area style, which is the backdrop or background for the plot space. So if I go to lines, I can turn on specific types of lines to control the spec limit. And if I go to style here, I can then change the cosmetics for that line. So let's say I want to see red dashed lines for my upper and lower spec. I can go here to pen, go to red, change the style to dash, and that will give me an upper and lower. The enter feature is the line that connects the series markers. We can leave that the same. And let's say I also want to know what my nominal line is within here, what's nominal. I could turn that on and maybe make that marker green and leave it a solid line. There's other types of lines that you can turn on, like a second set of spec limits if you have those available for your feature, reasonable limits, your center line, mean line, overlay for special cases, like if you're looking at a histogram chart, you can see a curve overlay. Trendline is a new one that helps you to see predictive trend. If your points or series tend to be trending in a certain direction, the trend line will either go up or down to indicate what the software is determining for the trending of your values, either going towards your upper tolerance or down towards your lower tolerance. There's user-defined lines which you can add, where you can put in your own lines based off of a static value or off of variable or combination of variables to decide the value where those lines should appear. And then there's something called extend target chart limits. That's for a special type of chart, target chart, which plots two axes at the same time that resembles a bullseye. So with the options I just chose, I have my green nominal line and I have my red dashed upper and lower spec limit. If I wanted to change the series marker itself, if I go back to properties, plot space, top area, I could go here to series. Here I can change the series marker. Right now it's circle. I could leave it circle but change the cosmetics on the inside, change the shape or the size of it. I could say no marker, asterisk, circle, diamond, square, or any other of these different marker types. I could choose the marker style. So I can make the pen, keep the pen black, but make the brush or the inside to also be black. The series is the connection lines between the markers. That could be changed as well if I want. And if I hit OK on that and OK, you'll see that change reflected in the markers here for your samples. Now say one of my samples goes out of tolerance. I could have the marker style change for that as well to indicate that condition. So if I go back to my plot space, hit edit, go to my top area and series, you have a set of different out of control conditions. Most of these involve using a control chart and having control limits calculated, but for regular trend charts, beyond limit and beyond limit 2 are the ones that can apply. So for beyond limit, if your series marker is greater or lower than the tolerance band, you can decide the style of the marker, the size of the marker, and the cosmetics of the marker as well. So perhaps you want that to be a red marker instead of a black marker, or maybe have a hollow X that fills in instead of a circle. So in order to see that, what we can try to do is look for a chart that might have data that's out of tolerance. So to do that, I'm going to do a shortcut method, which is go into the data set, go to my sift rules, and at the very bottom where it says hide show, I'll say show only rows triggered by event 1. And in the data set, if you remember, we set the event to out of tolerance, so this will make sure that the number of features in the data set now only shows those that have at least one value out of tolerance. And so now I'm doing that just so that you can see when the chart is looking at a feature that has values out of tolerance, you see that the feature marker itself has changed to the style that I chose for the out of tolerance marker. So those are some of the main or major options that come with viewing a chart. The last one I want to show is for the scaling. If you notice, the scaling happened automatically when I introduced my leader lines. It changed what these values were. But if I go to the properties, plot space, event, or edit, and go back to my top area, here I have my vertical axis scaling. So there's options for that as well. So if I go here to scale, one, these labels have to do with the labels of these values here on the vertical scale. Typically they're kept as decimal because you want to see what the highest and lowest value is. But if I turn this off, it will no longer automatically scale this to account for all the data and the spec limits, but instead you can put in a static scale and how much you want to increment by, and the scale will always stick to that value. You could also put in variables for the minimum and maximum. I believe I have this reversed actually. This should be -2 and that should be 2. So minimum and maximum. So now we have 2 at top, -2 at bottom. But if I wanted to, I could set these to be a variable or some combination of variables in order to set what the max and minimum is. For instance, I could have something like this. Max would be, I'll say tilde upper tolerance plus, and then parentheses 0.5. And then my minimum, I could have lower tolerance minus 0.5. And what this would do is look at what the tolerance values are of the feature it's reporting and scale the minimum value to be that lower tolerance minus 0.5, and then the top value would be the upper tolerance plus 0.5. So it's still dynamic, but you have more control as to what the scale would be. So again, if you have a chart style that you like and approve of, you could go to load save, save that off as a style, save to file. That could be saved into a folder that you use for chart styles. And that could be used later on if you made a new chart or needed to reload the style. For instance, I could click here on new chart, draw a new chart, and I can connect this again to that data set, maybe look at a different row. And then if I right click, well, let's see here, properties, data source A. So I'm going to make one change here. I'm going to turn off the sorting and the sift rules to go back to what it was originally. So now this is looking at row 1, that's looking at row 2. And if I want this style to look like that, again, I can say load save, load from file, load the chart object into here, now that that style is saved. And like the text boxes, I can have the leader line point to its proper location on the CAD image by going to Properties, Leader, choosing Data Source Feature, and then pointing to a particular name of the view object on the page. And then of course the marker would point to that particular feature marker on the CAD image. So those are some of the major options involved in creating and modifying the cosmetics of a chart. Thank you for watching this module, and we will continue on with the next one later on. So thank you again.